Slavery was a cruel and harsh reality that shaped the livelihood of a whole race and is still impacting it to this day. But some stories on slavery are told less than others. The fact that women could own slaves wasn't a piece of history a patriarchal America would want to be told, and what these female slave owners were doing to their slaves, especially their male ones, is beyond scary. This is exactly what we'll be talking about in this video. The dark truth: how white women abused black male slaves. Chapter 1. Overview of slavery in colonial America. Throughout human civilization, slavery happened at different periods to different groups of people. But none were at the scale of the transatlantic slave trade. The Portuguese were the first to ship slaves from Africa to their colonies in the late 1400s. Over the next 200 years, the French, Dutch, and English would join in. They bought slaves from the Upper Guinea coast down to the Gold Coast, Bight of Benin, and even as far as Central Africa. But that was just the beginning of a world-altering period of history. Because in the 16th century, with European nations colonizing even more lands, the need for more hands to toil on their farms and plantations arose. The solution was to ship even more slaves than before. At the peak of the transatlantic slave trade during the 16th to 19th century, roughly 13.5 million Africans were shipped through the Middle Passage to the Americas. Although only 4% ended up in North America, just before the Civil War, there were about 4 million slaves in the southern U.S. Nevertheless, in 1860, pro-abolitionist Abraham Lincoln was voted into power. This made southern states who didn't want slavery to end form a confederate, and thus started the American Civil War. However, the 300 years before freedom were 3 centuries of nothing but pain and anguish for black slaves in the South. The history books do tell you of the general cruelty of slave masters. But one thing the notable ones fail to mention is that not all evil slave masters were men. Chapter 2. Female slave owners. Fact or fiction? Being a woman in the early years of America's history was far from what it's like in modern America. They didn't have the right to own property, manage their money, or even vote. Their lives weren't that significant without a male figure in it. But despite the lack of autonomy, there was one thing they could do as much as men. In fact, in some households, they were doing it more than men, and that was owning slaves. One of America's founding fathers, George Washington, was a notable slave owner with over 100 slaves serving in his house. But here's the thing: 84 of them were not his. They belonged to his wife, Martha. A woman owning more slaves than her husband seems like an anomaly, especially if her husband is George Washington. But there were plenty of women in colonial America just like Martha. And it's really mind-blowing that despite the suppression of women's rights, they somehow were given a lot of freedom when it came to ownership of slaves. This is evidence, if there weren't any before, that these slave masters completely degraded blacks. It would seem that the men were okay to take over the top positions in society and own mansions, but slaves were just too small a price to fight women over. But it gets even worse. Now you might be thinking, since women are known for being soft-hearted, it means the majority of the slaves were not treated too poorly, right? Well, you are about to be surprised because it has been discovered that women were perhaps more ruthless as slave owners than their male counterparts. The reason for this, however, is not so surprising. You see, on the path to uncovering this whole truth, historian Stephanie Jones Rogers found a series of revelations that are not only shocking, but debunk what was previously thought true. She describes these findings in her book titled, "They Were Her Property: White Women as Slave Owners in the American South." For starters, women participated more in the trade of slaves than history has led us to believe. White girls grew up receiving training on slave ownership and discipline. You would think that infant girls would be getting pretty dresses and dolls as birthday gifts. But sometimes their gift would be enslaved people in their servitude. Even when they got married, they would still retain ownership of their slaves. And given how empowering owning slaves was, women in the South did their best to make slavery last as long as possible. In a society where owning slaves was really the only status symbol women could truly have, they made the most of it. Sometimes owning slaves was enough to woo suitors as it showed strength and value. Furthermore, with a slave-free North slowly dismantling the Confederate South, female slave owners became innovative. Worried that they were about to lose some major power, they would take it upon themselves to move slaves further down south, and away from freedom. Some households in the South even kept slaves long after slavery was abolished. But what were white women doing with these slaves that had them hell-bent on keeping them? Surely, it couldn't be for the power alone, right? After all, it's not like they still didn't rely on their white men for many things. So, there had to be more benefits, and indeed, there were. For one, the female slaves were forced to serve as wet nurses to help raise the children of white women. If this was the only thing, it wouldn't have been entirely awful. But they went further. You see, other female slaves were coercively impregnated, just so they were able to breastfeed white babies. This is just awful to imagine, and it makes you wonder what the men had to go through themselves. Chapter 3. The terrible fate of male slaves. Some male slaves were abused and used for the lustful gratification of their female slave owners. Yup, you heard me right. Elite female slave owners would coerce black slaves to lay with them, and if they didn't do as they were told, they would be accused of trying to force themselves on their owners. A slave saying no and standing his ground was as bad as witchcraft in 17th century America. A woman telling people that her black male slave deserves to be hanged because he refused to sleep with her sounds really dishonorable and not something she could get the sympathy she sought. But saying that a slave attempted to inappropriately touch her would garner the sympathy she needed. And it worked every time, because it was the word of an elite white woman against the word of a slave. No one would hear him out. Once again, this was a patriarchal America. The thought of their women being deflowered by a slave was eerie to them. You might as well just spit in their face. When cases like these were presented in court, the judge would often sentence the slave to capital punishment by the rope, and when presumed justice was taking too long to deliver, leave it to the people to carry it out. Angry mobs of white men would take it upon themselves to do what they felt was right: lynch a male black slave. During the 19th century in Cairo, Mississippi, a black man was jailed for attempting to be with a woman without her consent. His death was at the hands of an angry mob that carried out jungle justice. Sometimes a noose would take too long, and justice was discharged with the barrel of a gun. But either way, as soon as a woman utters that a slave attempted to lay with her, it was certain death for the man. However, some women were more feminine with their approach by manipulating male slaves with the promise of better treatment. Whether or not they were indeed treated better isn't exactly known. However, what happened after the slave mistress became pregnant for their slaves was another problem entirely. You see, the mixed children that females would give birth to would in turn become slaves. They would live on the slave master's estate, but no one dared talk about how they came about. But a white female bearing a mixed child was something society frowned upon. In fact, it was dangerous for a female to be caught doing this. And we are going to see a real-life case of that soon. But despite this danger, it wasn't uncommon for white females to exploit their black male slaves. They would often do these atrocious acts in secret for fear of the reproach it would bring if they were caught. This was something white slave owners didn't have to worry about. But if it was so outrageous for slave mistresses to bed with their slaves, why did they continue with the act at all? Well, for one, white female slave owners abused their male slaves this way as a means to exert dominance and power. In a society where they were made second fiddle to men, they turned to the abuse of their black male slaves to give them a feeling of strength. Sometimes their motive was simply to fulfill their lustful desires. Their husbands could go on long trips at stretches or simply not cater to their sensual needs and desires, so they resorted to abusing their slaves. And sometimes they were just bored and wanted to be adventurous. However, despite most slave mistresses having disingenuous intentions, some actually felt a strong desire and attraction towards their male servants. But that doesn't mean they didn't use exploitative means to get what they wanted. It was recorded that in Virginia during the 1820s, the daughter of a slave owner had an eye for one of her father's slaves. Her infatuation with the hunkiest and not the sharpest of the slaves led to her sleeping with him. She gave birth to a mixed child, the first grandchild of her father, and this did irreversible damage to the family's reputation. Likewise, most men who found out about the infidelity of their wives would divorce them. This was certainly the case of Dorothea and Louis Bourne. Dorothea would sneak around her neighbors, the Richardsons, who were owners of a slave named Edmund. Dorothea's mixed children were most likely a product of her affairs with Edmund. They were also all the evidence her husband Louis needed to believe his wife was unfaithful, and he had to divorce her. But Louis Bourne wasn't the only man divorcing his wife because she cheated on him by abusing a male slave. Between 1786 and 1851, 9% of all divorces in Virginia happened for this very reason. It gets even more interesting and, quite frankly, strange. You see, the wives of slave masters weren't asking for a divorce when their husbands bedded with female slaves. For some odd reason, they were even encouraging it. To think women in colonial America valued their husbands asserting dominance over their female slaves more than their fidelity is just wild. But America was a patriarchal society, so this isn't far-fetched. Sometimes white women would have their male slaves engage in copulation, not with themselves, but with their female slaves for the sole purpose of breeding. Oftentimes, it was against their will. This was a common practice to have slaves reproduce to have offspring who would be made into slaves too. For these slave mistresses, reproducing slaves meant more wet nurses available, as well as a larger slave population under their ownership. Because to them, their slaves were no different from livestock. Slavery and forced servitude were already bad enough, but the trauma of non-consensual intercourse and abuse was like salt on an already open wound. If this form of abuse did anything, it showed that white women were anything but innocent. They participated in the instigation of slavery as much as their husbands. At some points, they were even more cruel in their dealings with slaves, especially their male ones. Slavery apologists have often painted women in colonial America as if they were not only fellow victims of slavery, but actively fighting against it, when in fact, that was very contrary to the truth. How do you feel knowing this story about slavery that doesn't get told often? Let us know in the comment section, and don't forget to hit the like button and click subscribe for more videos like this.